I've always believed that desire has a specific scent. It's not a single note you can find in a bottle at a department store. It's not just the cloying sweetness of jasmine or the sharp artificial bite of bergamot. It's something far more primal than that. It's the smell of ozone just seconds before a lightning strike, that metallic electric charge in the air that tells your lizard brain to either run for cover or stand perfectly still and be consumed. It's the scent of anticipation, a sharp tension that makes the fine hairs on the back of your neck stand up before your mind even understands why. That night, the scent was so thick I could almost taste it on my tongue, like a storm waiting to break over the city. I was standing at the Mahagony bar of that rooftop lounge, my fingers tracing the cold condensation on a glass of gin and tonic I hadn't touched in 20 minutes. I was hiding, really. Hiding from the shallow chatter of people I didn't know and from the quiet, nagging void that had been growing in my chest for months. The lounge was a sea of tailored suits and silk dresses, a choreographed dance of wealth and boredom where I felt like an outsider looking through a gilded window. I was waiting for something, anything, to shatter the glass of my own existence. And then, the air in the room simply shifted. It wasn't a loud entrance. There was no fanfare, no dramatic pause in the jazz music. But the gravity of the room moved. I felt it before I saw him. A warmth, a presence that pulled at the edges of my consciousness. I turned my head, slowly, almost against my will, and that's when Julian stepped into my world. He stood by the entrance for a heartbeat, silhouetted against the amber glow of the elevators. He was tall, occupying his own skin with a build that suggested athletic grace, a swimmer's shoulders, broad and powerful, yet balanced by a lean, lithe waist. He wore a dark charcoal suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame, the fabric catching the light with every subtle movement. His hair was a dark, unruly mane, the kind of mess that clearly took effort to look so effortless, and he pushed it back with a long-fingered hand, the hands of a sculptor, strong yet capable of incredible delicacy. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. Even from across that crowded, smoke-filled room, they were piercing. They were the color of the Mediterranean just before a storm, a deep, turbulent teal that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets and a promise of total ruin. He moved through the crowd like a predator in a garden, unhurried and observant, and people moved for him without even realizing they were doing it. His gaze swept the room, dismissive of the glitter and the gold, until it landed on me. The world fell away. The jazz, the clinking of ice, the low roar of conversation, it all became white noise. He walked straight toward me, every step deliberate. When he reached the bar, he didn't crowd me, but the heat radiating from him made the cold glass in my hand feel like a block of ice. He looked at me, his voice like a low, vibrating chord of a cello, and told me that I looked like I was searching for a reason to leave, or perhaps a reason to stay, and that he'd spent the last 5 minutes wondering which one he should provide. My breath hitched, catching in a throat that had suddenly gone bone dry. His voice was a physical sensation, like aged bourbon, smooth, dark, and warm, sliding down my spine and pooling in the pit of my stomach. I looked up at him, my own reflection caught in the dark pools of his irises, and I asked him what made him think I hadn't already found a reason to stay. He gave me this small, devastating smirk, and said it was because I was holding my drink like a weapon, not a refreshment. And because I'd been looking at the exit more than the people in front of me. Until him. We talked for hours after that, though time had become a fluid, unreliable thing. Every sentence was a brush of silk against skin. He was charming, yes, but it was a thoughtful, heavy charm. He didn't just hear my words, he listened with his whole body, leaning in just enough to make the few inches of air between us feel like a private sanctuary. He told me about the way the light hits the ruins in Greece at dawn, and I found myself telling him about the weight of the silence at my home, about the way my mother, Sarah, seemed to be disappearing into the furniture, and about my own fear of following her into that invisibility. As the night wore on and the lounge emptied, he reached out, his hand hovering just an inch from mine, and suggested that we find a place where the air wasn't quite so crowded. I knew what he was asking, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the consequences. The ride home in the back of that town car was a torture of the best kind. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as streetlights painted neon streaks across his sharp jawline. He was a study in controlled power, not yet touching me, but the promise was there, thick and heavy. As we pulled up to the apartment, a sharp pang of guilt hit me. I thought of Sarah, curled up in her chair in the next room, lost in the silence she'd worn like a dull coat for a decade. Bringing Julian home felt like bringing a wildfire into a library. I whispered to him as we entered that we had to be quiet, that my mother was in the room right next to mine, and he just rumbled back, a low vibration in the dark, that we would be the masters of silence. The apartment was hushed, heavy with the history of our small, quiet family. The moment my bedroom door clicked shut, the world narrowed down to the size of my bed. Julian stood there in the moonlight, his silhouette magnificent. I wanted him with a ferocity that frightened me, but I wasn't ready to let the story end just yet. I wanted to savor the ache of anticipation. He noticed, of course, telling me I was overthinking again, and I told him I just wanted to enjoy the chapters before the finale. He stepped closer, his warmth radiating through my clothes, and whispered that we should write a very, very slow chapter tonight. He began to undress me with a reverence that made me feel like a masterpiece being unveiled. His touch traced the curve of my collarbone and the dip of my waist with such intention. When he was finally bare before me, I understood the true depth of my obsession. He was sculpted muscle and soft skin, a landscape I wanted to spend a lifetime exploring. I told him I wanted to wait for the final act, and he kissed my forehead with a sincerity that brought tears to my eyes. But the intimacy we shared instead was more profound than anything I'd ever known. I decided to give him everything I had in that moment, my focus, my adoration. The encounter was a symphony of muffled gasps and rhythmic breathing. As I focused on him, I felt his hands in my hair, his body tensing under my touch. His voice was reduced to low, guttural groans that vibrated through the mattress, a physical manifestation of the obsession I felt. I wanted to drink him in, to make him forget every other woman he'd ever known. In that room, with my mother just a few feet away through a thin wall, I felt more alive than I ever had. I was aware of the silence on the other side of that wall, wondering if she was listening, if she could hear the soft thud of the headboard or the stifled moans I couldn't quite keep inside. The air in the room was thick with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. As I focused every ounce of my being on him, my focus entirely on his pleasure, the world seemed to condense into a single point of pure sensation. I felt the tension in Julian's thighs, the way his fingers curled into the silk of my pillows, and the low, rumbling vibration of his voice as he whispered my name like a prayer. The encounter was a symphony of muffled gasps and rhythmic breathing, a physical manifestation of the obsession I felt. I wanted to drink him in, to make him forget every other woman he'd ever known. In that room, with my mother just a few feet away through a thin wall, I felt more alive than I ever had. Every time my lips moved against him, I was aware of the dangerous silence on the other side of that drywall. It added an electric edge to my worship, a sharp, metallic tang of fear and defiance. I watched his face in the pale moonlight, his eyes closed, his head thrown back against the headboard, his jawline a sharp, beautiful silhouette. When the moment finally came, it was an overwhelming wave of release, tasteful, warm, and utterly consuming. I felt his essence, a salty, heavy heat, as he reached his peak, and for a heartbeat, I felt like I was holding the very core of his power in my hands. He let out a low, guttural groan that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the apartment, a sound of total surrender that I gathered into myself like a trophy. In the quiet aftermath, as the echoes of his release faded into the hum of the city outside, Julian pulled me up into his arms. His skin was slick and radiating a heat that made my own feel sensitive, almost raw. We lay there, a tangle of limbs among the rumpled sheets, the scent of him, smoke, rain, and the musk of a man, filling my lungs. He ran a thumb over my lower lip, his eyes dark with a new kind of curiosity as he looked at me. He asked me about the house, about the woman who lived behind the wall, and why the atmosphere in this home felt like a garden that had been forgotten by the sun. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the steady, slowing thrum of his heart, and I found myself telling him the truth about Sarah. I told him that Sarah wasn't just my mother. She was a casualty of a war she hadn't known she was fighting. I described my father to him, a man who had been a master of masks, a man who possessed a charm that rivaled Julian's own but was poisoned by a hollow core. He had cheated on her for a decade, weaving a tapestry of lies so intricate that by the time it unraveled, there was nothing left of Sarah's world to salvage. When they finally divorced, he walked out like a guest leaving a hotel, leaving her to rot in the silence of her own faithfulness. I told Julian that the woman in the next room was beautiful. I wanted him to understand that she wasn't a withered gray matron. Sarah was thin, possessing a dancer's lithe elegance even in her late 30s. She was undeniably sexy, with a sharp, vibrant bone structure and eyes that used to hold the light of 1,000 fires. But the betrayal had done something terrible to her. It had hollowing her out, making her a ghost of her own potential. She never left the apartment anymore. She spent her days hiding behind the heavy curtains, relearning the topography of her own isolation. I confessed to him that I was terrified. I looked at her every day and I didn't see a mother. I saw a warning. I saw a possible future for myself, a life where I could be replaced, forgotten, and left to fade into the furniture of an empty home. That was why I was so desperate for the fire he brought. I told him I wanted to give everything to someone like him, someone perfect, because I believed that if I could hold on to a flame this bright, the shadows of Sarah's life could never catch up to me. I told him I was a bitch who was starving for the kind of attention that could validate my existence, that could prove I wasn't just another fading rose in a quiet tomb. Julian listened without interrupting, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. He seemed to drink in my confession, his gaze never leaving mine. He told me that beauty like ours was a family trait, but that a fire only burns if you let the air in. I felt a surge of dominance then, a strange, possessive power over the secrets of this house. I told him that my mother was a bitch too, once, and that even now, in her silence, she was vibrating with a need she refused to acknowledge. After Julian eventually drifted into a light sleep, his breathing steady and warm against my neck, I carefully disentangled myself from the sheets. My mouth felt dry, tasting of mint and the lingering heat of him, and I needed the cold clarity of the bathroom to ground myself. I crept out of the room, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors, moving like a ghost through the hallway. But as I passed my mother's door, I stopped. The silence of the apartment was brittle, easily broken by the smallest sound, and there it was, not a floorboard creaking, but a rhythm, a soft, ragged intake of breath, followed by a low, desperate hitch that made my blood run cold. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering near the bathroom door. I knew that sound. It was the sound of someone trying to swallow their own soul to keep from screaming. It was the sound of my mother, Sarah, alone in the dark, losing herself to a fantasy she had no right to be part of. Rage, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was using the echoes of my night to feed her own starvation. It felt like a violation, a twisted theft of the intimacy I had worked so hard to build with Julian. I wanted to pound on her door, to scream at her to get her own life, but the shame of it kept my fists clenched at my sides. I went into the bathroom and scrubbed my teeth until my gums bled, trying to wash away the feeling of her ears pressed against the wall. The next morning, the sunlight was too bright, too clinical. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to find the usual version of my mother, the one in the gray robe with the hollow eyes. But Sarah was already there, standing by the stove, and she looked different. She had done her hair, pulling it back in a way that emphasized the sharp, elegant line of her neck. She was wearing a silk blouse I hadn't seen in years, and there was a touch of rouge on her cheeks that looked like a defiant mask. I leaned against the doorframe, my voice dripping with a bitchy, morning-after cynicism I couldn't suppress. I looked at her and remarked how festive she looked, asking if there was a funeral for her modesty that I had missed. I was being a brat, I knew it, but the sound of her breathing from the night before was still ringing in my ears like a slap in the face. Sarah didn't even turn around at first. She just gripped the handle of the frying pan until her knuckles went white. When she finally looked at me, her eyes weren't sad anymore, they were blazing. She snapped back, calling me a selfish, reckless girl. She started an argument about how I could just bring some random man into our home without a word of warning, acting as if I had invited a predator into her sanctum. She accused me of having no respect for the life we had built, for the peace she had sacrificed everything to maintain. I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. I told her she didn't understand, that Julian wasn't just some random guy from a bar. I told her he was different, that he saw things in me that she had spent years trying to bury under her own bitterness. I told her she couldn't possibly understand what it was like to feel that kind of pull, because she had chosen to turn herself into a monument of grief. We stood there in that sun-drenched kitchen, two women snarling at each other over the ghost of a man who was still asleep in the next room, neither of us willing to admit that the real fight wasn't about Julian at all. It was about the fact that I had finally brought fire into a house that she had spent a decade turning into an icebox, and she was terrified of the melt. The air in the kitchen was no longer just heavy. It was suffocating, vibrating with the kind of electricity that precedes a catastrophic collapse. I stood there, my hand still gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard my knuckles were white, staring at this woman who was supposed to be my mother. But she didn't feel like my mother anymore. She felt like a rival, a stranger wearing a mask of familiar features. Her eyes, usually so dull and resigned, were now sharp, reflecting the morning light with a predatory glint that made the hair on my arms stand up. I spat out the word pathetic before I could stop myself, my voice dripping with the kind of cruelty only a daughter can inflict. I told her that I knew what she was doing, that I had heard her through the wall, and that it was the most disgusting thing I had ever experienced. I accused her of trying to steal the crumbs of my life because she was too cowardly to go out and find one of her own. I called her a leech, a ghost trying to haunt the only living thing left in this house. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I felt small, truly small. She looked me up and down with a cold, clinical detachment, as if she were assessing a competitor rather than her child. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and jagged, like broken glass skipping across silk. She told me that I was a selfish, narcissistic brat who didn't understand the first thing about the world I was so eager to conquer. She said that I was an envious bitch, a girl who walked through life as if every sunset and every drop of rain were orchestrated specifically for my amusement. She threw my words back in my face, telling me that I had no right to judge her hunger when I was currently gorging myself at a feast she hadn't seen in a decade. She asked me if I really thought I was the only one allowed to feel the pull of a man like Julian. She laughed, a sound that was more of a snarl, and said that I was just a child playing with matches, while she was a woman who had been left to freeze in the dark. She told me that I would have 1,000 more Julians, 1,000 more nights where the world felt like it was made of velvet and heat, but for her, the clock was ticking. She said that for a woman like her, a man like Julian wasn't just a date or a hookup. He was a reminder that she still existed, that she wasn't just a piece of furniture waiting to be moved out. Her anger was visceral, a living thing that filled the space between us. She told me that I was being a bitter, envious bitch because I couldn't stand the thought of her being seen. She accused me of wanting to keep her locked in her gray robe, a silent monument to her own betrayal, just so I could feel more vibrant by comparison. She said that I was the one who was truly pathetic, because I was so insecure that I felt threatened by my own mother's pulse. Then the tone of the room shifted. It became something darker, something more intimate and twisted. Sarah straightened her back, the silk of her blouse catching the light, and she looked toward my bedroom door. I saw her throat move as she swallowed, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that she wasn't just defending herself. She was staking a claim. She told me that maybe Julian was tired of girls who didn't know the value of what they held. She suggested, with a horrifyingly sensual confidence, that a man like him might actually appreciate a woman who understood the language of silence, who knew the depth of a real, bone-deep longing. She said that while I was busy being obsessed with the surface, she was the one who could understand the soul of a man who looked for beauty in the ruins. I felt a wave of nausea. I told her to stay away from him, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. I told her she was a bitch, a desperate, aging woman who was trying to crawl into her daughter's bed. I said she should have some dignity, some respect for the fact that I was the one who brought him here. She just smiled then. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It wasn't the smile of a mother. It was the smile of a hunter who had just found a weakness. She told me that dignity was a luxury for people who weren't starving. She said that she had given up everything for me, her youth, her beauty, her chance at a second act, and that she was done being a martyr. She said she was going to go into that room, and she was going to meet the man who had woken her up, and there was nothing I could do to stop her. We stood there, two predators in a sunlit kitchen, the silence between us screaming. I realized then that the dawn reflections weren't just about Julian. They were about the fact that this house was no longer a tomb. It was an arena. And as I watched Sarah turn toward the hallway, her silk blouse shimmering like armor, I knew that the perfection I had found in Julian had just unleashed a storm that would either burn us both alive or forge us into something entirely new. I followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, terrified of what would happen when the master of the shadows finally stepped into the light of the man who held the flame. The threshold of my bedroom door felt like a border between two warring countries, and as Sarah stepped across it, I felt the last remnants of my sanctuary crumble into dust. The air in the hallway had been sharp and acidic from our argument, but inside the room, it was still heavy with the ghosts of the night before. It was a thick, syrupy mixture of Julian's warmth, the salt of our shared exertion, and the faint, lingering scent of the gin we had shared on the rooftop. Seeing my mother walk into that space, my space, was like watching a bird of prey invade a nest. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at me with a mother's guilt or a housemate's apology. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that I hadn't seen in her since the days before the divorce, before the silence had turned her into a shadow. The morning light was filtering through the blinds in long, amber slats, carving Julian's form into a masterpiece of light and shadow. He was sprawled across the bed, the white linen sheets bunched around his waist in a chaotic tangle that made him look like a fallen deity. I watched Sarah's eyes as they swept over him. She didn't just look, she devoured. She took in the breadth of his shoulders, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, and the way one of his hands was curled into a fist near his pillow. I could see the pulse in her neck jumping, a frantic little beat that betrayed the cool, silk-clad exterior she had so carefully constructed. She was vibrating with a decade of suppressed hunger, a starvation so profound that it seemed to pull the very oxygen out of the room. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed, my own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to scream at her to get out, to remind her that this was my room, my man, my life. But the words were stuck in my throat, choked by a sick, voyeuristic fascination. I was watching my mother rediscover her own pulse at the expense of my betrayal. She walked to the edge of the bed, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, and for a moment she just stood there, towering over him. The contrast was agonizing. She was draped in shimmering silk, her hair perfectly coiffed, a woman reclaimed from the ruins. He was raw, naked, and vulnerable in his sleep, yet he still possessed a magnetic power that seemed to draw her closer with every breath he took. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch above the skin of his shoulder. I saw the way her hand trembled, a minute vibration that spoke of a terrifying lack of control. She wasn't my mother in that moment. She wasn't the woman who had packed my lunches or comforted me after my father left. She was Sarah, a woman who had been left to freeze in a tomb of her own making, and she had finally found a fire hot enough to melt the ice. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, melodic hum that felt like a physical caress against the stillness of the room. She told him to wake up, her voice laced with a honeyed confidence that made my stomach turn. She said the sun was far too bright for him to be hiding in the dark, and as the words left her lips, I saw Julian's muscles tensed, his body reacting to her presence before his mind even understood who she was. Julian stirred, a low, guttural groan escaping his throat, a sound that I had heard only hours before in a completely different context. It was a sound of transition, of a man returning to a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. His eyes opened, dark and clouded with sleep, and for a heartbeat, he looked disoriented. He looked for me, his gaze sweeping toward the door where I stood like a ghost, but Sarah intercepted him. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the weight of her body causing the springs to moan, bringing her close enough to him that their shadows merged on the wall. The air between them was electric, thick with the scent of her sandalwood perfume and the raw, unwashed heat of his skin. I watched as Julian's nostrils flared, catching the scent of a new predator in his den. He propped himself up on one elbow, the sheets slipping even lower, and I saw the way Sarah's gaze dropped to the defined line of his hip, her pupils dilating until her eyes were almost entirely black. He looked at her, his voice a deep, vibrating rumble as he noted that she wasn't me. He didn't sound surprised, he sounded intrigued. He sounded like a man who had walked into a gallery expecting one masterpiece and finding another, perhaps more complex, work of art instead. Sarah let out a small, breathless laugh that sounded like the chime of a silver bell. She told him she was the reason I existed, introducing herself as Sarah, and I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. She was claiming credit for me while simultaneously trying to eclipse me. She told him it was time they moved past the introductions through the drywall, her voice dropping to a sensual whisper that implied a level of intimacy they hadn't even earned yet. She was flirting with a Gatlastalonshog that was both impressive and revolting. She was using the silence of the last 10 years as a weapon, a reservoir of untapped energy that she was now pouring into the space between her and Julian. I watched the way Julian reacted. He was a man who understood the language of desire, who lived in the nuances of attraction, and he was reading Sarah with a clinical, predatory intensity. He didn't look away from her. He didn't reach for his clothes or try to cover himself. He remained exposed, a king on his throne, enjoying the spectacle of two women vying for his light. He looked at the curve of her neck, the way her silk blouse strained against her chest as she leaned in, and I saw the smirk return to his lips, that dark, knowing smirk that told me he was enjoying the chaos. He told her that he had been told this house was a tomb, but looking at her, it seemed the reports of her demise were greatly exaggerated. Sarah leaned closer, her face only inches from his, her red lips a stark contrast against the pale light of the room. She whispered that perhaps she just needed the right reason to rise, her eyes locked on his with a desperate, terrifying intensity. I could see the game she was playing. She wasn't just trying to attract him, she was trying to possess the very essence of the fire I had brought home. She wanted to prove that she wasn't the relic I had called her, that she was still a force to be reckoned with, a woman who could command the attention of a man like Julian, even when standing next to her own daughter. I stood there, a silent witness to my own displacement. I thought about the night before, about the way I had felt so powerful, so womanly, only to realize now that I was just a catalyst for a much larger explosion. Sarah was a master of the long game, a woman who had spent a decade refining her hunger, and now that she had found a target, she was relentless. She began to talk to him about the things she had heard, the sounds of our night, the rhythm of our passion, and she used those memories not as a source of shame, but as a bridge. She suggested that a man like him might appreciate a woman who understood the true value of silence, who knew the depth of a longing that lasted years rather than hours. Julian reached out, his hand grazing her wrist, his fingers lingering on the pulse point where her blood was racing. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, a sense of betrayal that was so physical I almost gasped. He looked at her, then glanced at me standing in the doorway, a cold, assessing look that made me feel like an outsider in my own life, and then he turned back to her. He was shifting his focus, leaning into the maturity and the polished desperation that Sarah offered. He was a collector of experiences, and my mother was a rare, vintage piece he hadn't expected to find in this quiet, dusty apartment. The room was no longer my bedroom. It was a stage, an arena where the master of the shadows was finally stepping into the light to reclaim what she believed was hers. I watched as Julian's fingers curled around her hand, pulling her just a fraction closer, and I realized that the fight in the kitchen was just the beginning. This was the real war. Sarah was playing for keeps, her every word and gesture designed to weave a web around Julian that I wouldn't be able to break. She was showing him a side of herself that even I hadn't seen, a raw, electric sensuality that had been forged in the fires of her own loneliness. I felt a surge of a new, darker energy. If she wanted to play the hunter, then I would have to become something else. I wouldn't be the invisible daughter anymore. I stepped further into the room, my own voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. I told them both that it was a crowded bed for such a small room, my eyes burning with a defiance that I hoped would mask the trembling of my soul. I looked at my mother, at the silk and the rouge and the desperate hunger in her eyes, and I realized that the perfection I had found in Julian had just torn our lives open. There was no going back to the way things were. The tomb was empty, the ghosts were out, and the morning light was only going to get brighter. Sarah didn't even look at me. She just kept her eyes on Julian, her thumb grazing the back of his hand in a way that was entirely too familiar. She told him that some rooms are meant to be crowded, that the best things in life are often the ones that are the most difficult to contain. She was challenging him, challenging me, and challenging the very walls of the house that had kept her prisoner for so long. And Julian? He just sat there, a dark, handsome catalyst for our destruction, watching us both with a look that said he couldn't wait to see who would be the last one standing when the storm finally subsided. I realized then that I hadn't just brought a man home. I had brought a mirror, and neither I nor my mother liked what we were seeing in our own reflections. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was a pressurized chamber, filled with the static of 3 different hearts beating at 3 different rhythms. I stood there, anchored to the floorboards of my own bedroom, feeling like a temporary occupant in a life I had thought was mine. The morning light was no longer just a witness. It was an intruder, exposing every crease in the tangled sheets, every flush on my mother's skin, and the devastating, effortless power Julian held simply by existing in the center of our chaos. I watched him, my chest aching with a mixture of desperate love and a rising, cold fear. He was propped up against the headboard, the white linen framing the dark, tanned expanse of his chest, and he looked at Sarah with a gaze that was entirely too steady, too appreciative. I waited for the rejection. I waited for him to look at me, to reach out a hand and pull me back into the circle of his warmth, to signal to Sarah that she was an intruder. But instead, Julian did something much more dangerous. He leaned into the moment. He smiled, not the sharp, predatory smirk he had given me at the bar, but a soft, courtly expression that carried the weight of a different kind of respect. He looked at Sarah, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. He told her that he had spent the last few hours wondering where a girl like me could have inherited such a rare and radiant intensity. But seeing her now, the mystery was entirely solved. He said it so politely, so elegantly, that it didn't even feel like a betrayal at first. It felt like a decree. He was acknowledging the lineage of the beauty he had spent the night worshipping. My heart plummeted, a cold stone dropping into an abyss. In that second, I was convinced I had lost him. I saw the way Sarah's entire being responded to his words. It was like watching a wilted flower drink in a sudden, torrential rain. She straightened her back, her silk blouse shimmering like a second skin, and the rouge on her cheeks seemed to glow with a heat that came from deep within. She was no longer the woman who had cried in the kitchen. She was a queen receiving a long overdue tribute. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic. I was terrified that Julian had seen the shadow in her and found it more compelling than the light in me. I was terrified that my mother, with her decades of stored-up longing and her polished, desperate elegance, was a masterpiece he couldn't resist adding to his collection. But then, the energy in the room shifted again, taking a turn I never could have predicted. Sarah didn't use his compliment to push me aside. Instead, she reached back with one hand and gestured toward me, her eyes never leaving Julian's. She started to talk about me, but she did it in a way that felt like she was showing off a prize she had painstakingly crafted. She told him to look at me, really look at me. She spoke of the way my skin carried the same translucence hers once had, how the fire in my eyes was a direct inheritance of a spirit she had tried to protect for 20 years. She wasn't just my mother in that moment. She was the artist presenting her finest work to a connoisseur who truly understood its value. She began to brag, her voice a low, sensual hum that filled every corner of the room. She spoke of our beauty as a shared currency, a secret language that only the three of us in that room seemed to speak. She told Julian that I was the best part of her, the living evidence that her youth hadn't been wasted, but merely distilled into something more vibrant. And Julian, he watched us both. He sat there, a dark, handsome anchor in a sea of feminine pride, playing the role of the appreciative audience. He didn't pick a side. He didn't have to. He was enjoying the spectacle of a woman reclaiming her throne while simultaneously crowning her successor. The conversation turned into a complex, delicate dance of flirtation. It was a game played on the razor's edge of propriety. I could see that Sarah wasn't trying to steal him into her own bed. Not really. She was just reveling in the fact that she was being seen. She was drinking in the validation that a man like Julian provided, using his presence to remind herself that she was still a woman, still desirable, still capable of holding the attention of the sun. She would lean in, her silk brushing against his arm, and then she would pull back and praise my youth, my hambasag, my potential. It was a dizzying display of maternal pride and raw, electric womanhood. I stood there, my anger slowly giving way to a profound, hollow confusion. I watched them flirt, watched the way Julian's eyes would dance between the two of us, finding different things to admire in each. He was appreciative of the source and the result, the memory and the promise. He would make a comment about the curve of Sarah's neck, and then immediately link it to the way I carried my head when I walked. He was weaving us together into a single, cohesive narrative of desire. It was as if he had realized that the only thing better than one beautiful woman was the history of that beauty standing right in front of him. Sarah was glowing. The bitterness of the kitchen was gone, replaced by a radiant, almost intoxicating confidence. She was showing off. She was showing off her thin, elegant frame, the way she could still command a room with a single whisper, and she was showing me off as the ultimate proof of her own worth. She was telling Julian that we were a matched set, a rare find that he was lucky to have stumbled upon. And for a moment, I saw the truth of her life. She hadn't been hiding because she was ashamed. She had been hiding because she was starving for exactly this, to be recognized by someone who wasn't afraid of the fire. I realized then that the perfection I had found in Julian wasn't just for me. He was a mirror that reflected the light back at whoever stood before him. My mother was standing in that light for the first time in a decade, and as much as it hurt my pride, as much as it made my skin crawl with a territorial jealousy, I couldn't deny the beauty of her resurrection. She was a Shuka who had finally found a master of the hunt, but she wasn't hunting him, she was hunting herself. She was proving to the walls of the house, to the silence of the last 10 years, and to the ghost of my father, that she was still here. Julian reached out again, his hand lingering on the sheets between them, and the static in the air was deafening. He told Sarah that he had never seen a more perfect illustration of how time can be a gardener rather than a thief. He was being so incredibly polite, so charmingly respectful, and yet the undercurrent was pure, unadulterated heat. He was acknowledging her as a peer, a woman of depth and history, while keeping me anchored as the object of his immediate, burning obsession. He was creating a world where both of us could exist, where we didn't have to be rivals, but could instead be part of the same beautiful storm. As I watched them, the desperation in my soul began to change shape. I was still jealous, still terrified of losing the exclusivity of his gaze, but I was also witnessing something sacred. I was seeing the tomb of our home being torn open by a man who didn't care about the rules or the drywall. He had brought the light, and my mother was finally standing in it. She looked at me, her eyes bright with a mixture of triumph and a strange, deep love, and I realized that we were no longer mother and daughter in a quiet apartment. We were two women in a sun-drenched room, being worshipped by a man who saw the beauty in our shared blood, and for the first time in my life, I understood that desire was a force that could heal just as easily as it could destroy. "I'll let you get dressed now, Julian," Sarah finally said, her voice airy and confident, carrying a weight of self-assurance that felt like a physical blow, not of pain, but of a sudden, sharp clarity to my heart. She didn't just stand by the door. She took a slow, deliberate step back toward the bed, her silk blouse shimmering like liquid silver in the morning light. She reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the duvet just inches from his bare hip, her eyes tracing the sculpted lines of his abdomen with a slow, appreciative hunger. Though, I must say, the morning light does you far more justice than the shadows ever could. You have a way of occupying a room that makes everything else, even the furniture, feel like an afterthought. Julian smirked, that dark, intoxicating expression deepening as he watched her. He didn't reach for the sheets to cover himself. Instead, he leaned back against the headboard, fully leaning into her gaze. "The appreciation is mutual, Sarah," he rumbled, his voice a low, vibrating chord that seemed to hum in the very floorboards. "It's rare to find a house that offers such a multi-layered welcome. Most people hide their treasures. You seem to have decided to let yours breathe." Sarah let out a soft, melodic laugh, a sound that carried the echo of the life I had almost forgotten she possessed. She leaned in just a fraction closer, the scent of her sandalwood perfume mingling with the musky, spent heat of the room. "I've spent 10 years breathing in dust, Julian. I think I've earned a little fresh air, and I've always found that the most generous gifts are the ones shared in the light of day." She checked an invisible watch on her wrist, though her eyes never left the dark hair on his chest. "Breakfast is almost ready. I've prepared something special. I wouldn't want the coffee to go cold while you're busy being admired." She gave him one last, lingering look, not of a hunter, but of a woman who had finally been reminded that she existed, before finally turning on her heel. She glided out of the room with a grace that made my throat tighten. The silk of her blouse whispered against the hallway walls, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a sigh of relief. The door didn't click shut, but the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The heavy, predatory energy I had imagined Sarah brought in evaporated, replaced by a stinging sense of my own smallness. I stood by the foot of the bed, my skin still humming from the night, but my soul felt heavy with a newfound shame. I realized that the masterpiece I had brought home wasn't just for me to hoard in secret. Julian remained where he was, watching me with those Mediterranean eyes. He didn't reach for his clothes immediately. Instead, he reached out a hand, gesturing for me to come closer. I walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, my hands trembling in my lap. Not from jealousy, but from the weight of a sudden, crushing realization. "I saw the way you looked at her," I whispered, the words coming out soft, lacking the sharp edge I had intended earlier. And for the first time, Julian, I didn't feel the sting of anger. I felt a wave of shame so deep it made my head spin. Julian reached out and took my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine. His skin was still hot, but the heat felt grounding now. He didn't say anything, waiting for me to find the words. "I've been such an incredibly selfish girl," I continued, looking down at our joined hands. "I brought you here in secret, sneaking you through the halls as if this house were mine alone. I never stopped to think about her. I never stopped to think about Sarah, the woman who spent a decade in a tomb I helped build with my own indifference. She's been so alone, Julian. My father broke her, and then I buried her under the weight of my own life, never once considering that she was still a woman with a pulse." I looked up at him, my eyes stinging. I saw her in that silk blouse, with that rouge on her cheeks, and my first instinct was to be a bitter, envious brat. I called her a hunter in my mind. I thought she was trying to steal my moment. But she wasn't. She was just breathing. She was being praised by a man for the first time in an eternity, and I was actually mad at her for it. How could I be so cruel? To bring a man like you into her home, to let her hear the sounds of our intimacy through the wall, and then to expect her to remain a ghost? Julian pulled me closer until I was leaning against his chest, the scent of him, smoke and rain, filling my senses. He ran a hand down my back, but it wasn't a possessive gesture this time. It was comforting. "She needed to be seen, Chloe. Everyone needs to be seen. You gave her that, even if you didn't mean to." I was the selfish one. I whispered into his skin. I treated her like an obstacle instead of a human being. She's a single mother who has given everything to me, and I couldn't even give her the respect of an introduction. I was so caught up in my own perfect night that I didn't care if I broke the silence of her isolation with the noise of my own pleasure. I saw her flirting with you, and instead of being happy that she felt beautiful for 5 minutes, I wanted to claw her eyes out. I was an unzuribi, wasn't I? Julian smirked, but it was a gentle look. He leaned down to press a firm kiss to my forehead. "You were protective of your fire, Chloe. That's human. But realizing there's enough heat to warm more than one person, that's growth. She doesn't want to take me from you. She just wanted to remember what it feels like to have the sun shine on her. You saw her transformation. That wasn't about me. That was about her realizing she still had a place in the world." He sat up fully then, the morning sun highlighting the sharp line of his jaw. "She's a master of a different kind of game now. She's found her dignity again. And you, Chloe, were the catalyst. Don't drown in your guilt. Just walk out there and see her for who she is. Not just your mother, but a woman who has survived a very long winter." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the shaking in my soul. I watched him as he began to dress, every movement a study in grace, but I wasn't just marking him as mine anymore. I was preparing to share the morning with the woman I had spent too long ignoring. I realized that the dawn reflections were truly about the light hitting the dark corners of our home. We were going to walk out there, and I was going to look my mother in the eye, not as a rival, but with the respect she had earned through 10 years of silent sacrifice. As Julian's fingers squeezed mine, I knew the fire was roaring, and this time, I wanted it to warm the whole house. Entering the kitchen felt like stepping through a portal into a past I had only ever seen in faded, silver screen photographs. The sterile, stagnant air that had defined this apartment for an entire decade, the smell of dust, old books, and unvented silence, had been replaced by a sensory assault of warmth and vibrant life. The aroma of dark roasted coffee was thick enough to taste on the back of my tongue, mingled with the sharp, savory scent of fresh basil and the rich, golden sizzle of herbs hitting a hot pan. Sarah was there, and she was a revelation. She moved with a fluid, rhythmic precision that I hadn't seen since I was a small child, watching her prepare for the grand parties of my youth, the ones that died the very day my father walked out. I stood in the doorway, my heart heavy with a sudden, crushing weight of realization that felt like lead in my chest. I looked at the way the morning sun poured through the open curtains, catching the swirling steam from the coffee and turning the kitchen into a sanctuary of amber and molten gold. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and the word selfish pulsed in my mind like a rhythmic, painful ache. I had spent years treating her like a piece of furniture, a silent background character in the drama of my own life. I had brought Julian home like a thief in the night, hoarding his attention, terrified that even a sliver of his light might touch her. I had been a selfish, guarded girl, so wrapped up in my own perfect night that I hadn't stopped to think about the woman who had spent 10 years rotting in a tomb of my own indifference. Julian followed me in, and the very molecular structure of the room seemed to realign itself to accommodate his presence. He wasn't the predatory stranger from the bar anymore. He was a master of ceremonies, his movements slow and deliberate as he took in the scene. Sarah turned toward us, and the rouge on her cheeks, which I had judged so harshly and cynically just an hour ago, now looked like a soft, triumphant bloom of life. Her eyes, usually so dull and resigned, were bright with a sapphire fire that matched the brilliance of the morning sky. She looked like she was finally remembering how to breathe. "Sit, please," she said, her voice a warm, melodic hum that carried a confidence I had forgotten she possessed. She gestured to the table with a grace that made the simple act of serving breakfast look like a high-stakes performance. I've always believed that the first meal of the day sets the tone for the entire future. And after a night of such intense reflections, I thought we all deserved something substantial. Julian pulled out my chair first, a silent, courtly gesture that felt like a secret pact between us. But as he took the seat next to mine, his focus didn't stay on me. He turned towards Sarah as she brought the plates to the table, the good porcelain, the gold-rimmed plates that usually gathered dust, and his gaze was a study in profound, unadulterated respect. It wasn't the look of a man hunting for a new prize. It was the look of a connoisseur recognizing a masterpiece that had been hidden in the dark for far too long. "Sarah," Julian rumbled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the very air in the kitchen shimmer. "The effort you've put into this, it's not just a meal. I can see the intent in every detail. Most people have forgotten that hospitality is an art form, but you seem to remember things the rest of the world has lost. It's breathtaking to see." I watched my mother as she drank in his words. It was like watching a parched garden receive its first rain in a decade. She sat down across from us, her hands gracefully folded on the table, her posture regal and poised. She wasn't just my mother in that moment. She was Sarah, a woman who was finally being seen by eyes that understood her worth. Julian's flirtation was masterful. It was subtle, polite, and deeply flattering, designed not to seduce her away from me, but to validate the very core of her femininity. He questioned her about the herbs she used, about the history of the apartment, and with every word, he treated her like she was the most fascinating person he had ever met. And yet, beneath the table, out of sight of Sarah's bright, hopeful eyes, Julian's hand found mine. His fingers interlaced with mine with a firm, possessive strength that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. His palm was warm, his grip steady, a secret anchor in the midst of this public performance. While he gave Sarah the words she needed to thaw her frozen soul, he was giving me the physical reassurance that I was the center of his world. He was holding my hand as if to say, "I am doing this for her, but I am here for you." The guilt I felt was overwhelming, but it was a different kind of guilt now. It was the guilt of a daughter who had finally realized the depth of her own cruelty. I looked at Sarah and saw the thinness of her wrists, the elegant line of her neck, and the way she practically vibrated with a need for the kind of attention I had taken for granted. I had been a selfish brat, a bitter girl who wanted to claw her eyes out just for wanting to feel beautiful for 5 minutes. I had brought a man like Julian, a man of fire and light, into a house of shadows, and then I had been angry at the shadows for trying to reach for the flame. "Chloe," Julian said, his eyes still locked on Sarah's as he continued his delicate dance of praise, but his thumb began to trace rhythmic, soothing circles on the back of my hand. "Your mother was just explaining the philosophy of her garden. She has a rare understanding of how to make things grow in difficult conditions. I think she's the real master of the storm in this house." Sarah laughed, a genuine melodic sound that I hadn't heard since I was a child. "The storm has been quiet for a long time, Julian. I'm just relearning how to listen to the wind. It's been so long since anyone cared to hear my side of the story." "Then you should listen closely," Julian countered, his smirk returning, dark and knowing. He leaned slightly toward her, and for a second, the tension in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. "Because a woman with your depth, Sarah, a woman who possesses the source of the fire I see in Chloe, You shouldn't be listening to the wind from behind closed curtains. You should be the one directing it. You have a vintage elegance that the modern world simply cannot replicate. I felt my mother's pride soar. She looked at Julian not as a threat to her daughter, but as a mirror reflecting a version of herself she had thought was dead and buried. And I realized that Julian was a genius of intimacy. He was giving her exactly what she needed: respect, recognition, and a sense of being a woman again, all while his hand remained anchored to mine, a silent promise that our night was the foundation, not just a fleeting moment. I squeezed Julian's hand under the table, a silent apology and a silent thank you. I looked at Sarah and smiled, a real smile this time, devoid of the bitchy cynicism I had carried into the kitchen. I realized that my mother wasn't trying to steal him. She was just trying to remember what it felt like to be admired by a man who knew how to look at a woman properly. She was an exhausted, lonely woman who had given everything to a daughter who had repaid her with silence. Julian's thumb continued its steady, possessive rhythm on my skin, keeping me grounded while he worked his magic on Sarah. He spoke of the future, of the garden, of the way the light in Italy would suit a woman of her poise. He was making her feel like a contender again, like she still had a place in the arena of desire. And as I watched the two of them, I realized that the reflections of the dawn weren't just about Julian and me. They were about the reclamation of this entire home. We were no longer hiding in the shadows of my father's betrayal. We ate in a comfortable, vibrant silence that was punctuated by the clink of gold-rimmed porcelain and the sound of my mother's newfound confidence. Julian had cracked the tomb open, and instead of a ghost, he had found a woman waiting to be rediscovered. I wasn't the master of the storm, and neither was Sarah. Julian was the storm, and we were both finally, undeniably, standing in the center of the rain. As the breakfast drew to a close and Julian's fingers gave mine one final, crushing squeeze before releasing me, I knew that the silence of the last 10 years was gone forever. The fire was roaring, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just hoarding the heat. I was watching it save my mother's life. I was no longer the selfish girl from the night before. I was a woman who understood that true beauty only grows when it is shared in the light.